As all of you, of course, know, over the last 24 hours, to be precise, over the course of last night, the much debated, much predicted, much anticipated Iranian strike against Israel took place. And even as that strike was underway, the spinning machines on both sides were whirring and in full operation. And the result is that we now have two diametrically opposite narratives about what happened. Now, the narrative, the account which is coming from Israel, and which is, of course, universally accepted throughout the West, from the Western media, is that the Iranian attack, the Iranian missile strike, was a complete failure. The Israelis and their allies, the British, the French, I'm not sure fully whether the Americans also were involved, but I have no, at least they don't seem to be confirming that, but I'm going to assume that they were. Anyway, they are claiming that 99% of the Iranian drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles launched by Iran against Israel were shot down. And whilst they do concede that some missiles did get through, the damage supposedly was very minor. That's what Israel and its allies are saying. On the other side, lots of claims that missiles did get through, significant damage was done, and there's claims in particular that Iranian missiles managed to hit two Israeli air bases, the Nevatim air base and the Ramon air base. So we have, as I said, diametrically different accounts. The Israelis talk about a total flop. The Iranians talk about a massive success. Now, I think that actually we can come to some conclusions about what actually happened, though I want to make it very clear that I'm not an expert. I'm not the person who is being kept informed by the Israeli Defense Forces or the Iranian military, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which seems to have been the organizer of this strike. But I think if we piece all the facts together and look at some of the more useful reports, we can actually get some sense of what actually happened over the course of last night. But before I do that, let me also make a perhaps more important point, and it takes us back to that article in the Financial Times that I spoke about yesterday. That article suggested that the United States and Iran were in deep discussions with each other, that there was lots of secret communications passing backwards and forwards between the Americans and the Iranians, that the Iranians were also in contact with all sorts of parties across the Middle East, all their regional allies, almost certainly their BRICS allies, the Russians, the Chinese as well, that there were lots of discussions and communications going on, and that the Iranians essentially briefed the Americans about what they intended to do, that the Americans essentially told the Iranians that they would try to keep the situation under control. If the Iranians did, the Iranians said that they were only going to engage in a limited strike, but one which would demonstrate technical prowess and which was intended, perhaps more than anything else, as a show of force, and that the Americans, for their part, said that if Iran confined itself to that, then the United States would do whatever it could to keep the situation under control. And I am going to suggest that the way things are playing out for the moment tracks very closely the information we got in that Financial Times article. Let's look at what happened last night. Firstly, the initial reports told us that a fleet of drones, these are Shahed drones, the original prototype upon which Russia's Uranium-2 drones are based. Anyway, a fleet of these drones had taken off from Iran and was flying towards Israel, giving the Israelis 3.5 hours notice of the fact that they were on their way. And that, of course, immediately alerted the Israelis to the fact that there was a drone fleet on its way. They were given ample notice that it was coming. The United States, it is clear, was already informed about the fact that there was going to be an attack by Iran on Israel. There were reports even before the drones took off that the attack would happen on Sunday. It is overwhelmingly likely, following on from that Financial Times article, that in fact it was the Iranians themselves who told the Americans that this was the case. So the Israelis and the Americans and all the other players were informed in advance of the strike before it happened. And the second thing to say is that it is absolutely clear to me that the targets of these strikes were certain Israeli military installations, specifically 2 air defense bases. An effort seems to have been made to avoid inflicting civilian casualties or even military casualties on any significant scale. Specifically, and note, exactly as we were told in the Financial Times article, the Iranians made no attacks on on Israeli embassies or diplomatic buildings, of which there are some now in the Middle East. They took no action of that kind. They don't seem to have engaged in any attacks on Israeli officials. They did capture an Israeli-owned ship, commercial ship, in the Persian Gulf, but then they gave assurances that this seizure of this ship was unconnected with the operation that they carried out. So clearly, an attack limited in its objectives, and one of which the Israelis and the Americans were given ample prior warning. And then the attack, of course, did take place. And here, of course, is where the conflicting accounts come. Because was the attack a success or was it a failure? Now, given the political nature of this attack, the fact that it was done as much for show or for a demonstration of Iranian resolve following the attack on their embassy, it's perhaps important to understand that the Iranians were not seeking to cause significant damage on Israel. They did not attack power stations, Israel's only nuclear power station. They did not seek, so far as we can tell, to attack command centers. So what exactly did they do? And did they actually achieve anything? Well, we're getting claims that hundreds of drones and hundreds of missiles were involved. Now, I'm going to say that we are talking here about an Iranian attack, but Iranian sources make it quite clear that it wasn't just Iran that participated in this attack. Hezbollah also clearly fired rockets and missiles at Israel. It seems as if the Houthis did the same, and it could be that some militia groups in Iraq or Syria were also involved. Given that part of the purpose of this attack, from the Iranian point of view, was to reassure their own allies in the Middle East, Hezbollah, the militia groups in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis, of their determination and resolve. That is unsurprising. The Iranians would have wanted, in that case, to involve their allies in this attack, if only to cement the relationship and to make them feel that they were indeed involved in a joint enterprise with Iran playing a major role within it. Now, if you add together all the various rockets and missiles that Iran itself and its various allies, the Houthis, the Hezbollah militia, the Syrian militia, the Iraqi militias, all launched at Israel, then it is likely that you will get figures that approximate to the claims that hundreds of missiles and drones were involved in this attack. But it's likely that the proportion of drones, the number of drones and missiles, especially missiles, that were launched by Iran was significantly smaller than this. Now, important point to bear in mind is that the Iranian strike came from within Iran. And if one looks at the distances, then that means very long-range cruise and ballistic missiles in order for those missiles to reach Israel. The distances are substantial. What missiles does Iran have that can travel these distances? Well, it does have subsonic cruise missiles. These can be detected and shot down. I've seen claims that around 20 of these were used. It seems that all of them were indeed shot down by Israel's very sophisticated air defenses, and no doubt through the assistance of some of its allies. However, it does seem that Iran launched ballistic missiles against Israel as well. These ballistic missiles have ranges of certainly more than 500 kilometers to be able to reach Israel from Iran. That means that they can achieve hypersonic speeds, and it does seem that some of these ballistic missiles got through, and ballistic missiles of this kind are much more difficult to shoot down. And these are the missiles that appear to have struck the two bases, the Nevatim Air Base and the Ramon Air Base. And I suspect that these were the missiles that we were reading about in the Financial Times that the Iranians were intending to use, and which were intended to demonstrate technical prowess. So within this larger attack involving drones and cruise missiles and rockets from Hezbollah, probably some of the multiple launch rocket systems, probably unguided, rockets also launched by the Houthis from Yemen. Within that, there was a core element of long-range ballistic missiles launched from within Iran, and those more difficult to intercept. And some of them, at least, managed to get through. So I think that we need to perhaps understand that. I'm not going to try and count how many of these ballistic missiles did get through, but some did. And we have film and photographic evidence which appears to confirm this. And we also have comments from the Israelis themselves that some damage was done, even if it was minor. which is in effect an admission that some missiles got through. It also seems that some of the Shahed drones also got through. Again, it's difficult to say exactly how many were involved. The Israelis are giving enormous numbers. They might be true, but some at least do seem to have managed to get through and to hit some targets. Again, there are pictures that appear to show this. I'm not the best person to analyze or even look at pictures, but it does seem as if at least some Shahed drones reached Israel. Not all of them were shot down on the way, and some damage by these drones was done. Now, there is an intriguing claim which I am not sure whether or not to believe. I'm going to treat it with some skepticism, but it is circulating on the internet. It's appearing on Russian Telegram channels especially, but there are suggestions that one particular missile, the one that actually did the damage to the Nevatim airbase and the Ramon airbase, the one that got through, is not only a ballistic missile, but it is a ballistic missile which supposedly launches in its terminal phase a hypersonic glide vehicle, and that Israel, and indeed the Western powers, have no capability to intercept a glide vehicle of that kind. Now, if that is correct, that would fully correspond with the claim that appeared in the Financial Times article yesterday about the Iranians wanting to demonstrate a new capability in order to demonstrate technical prowess. Now, is it within Iran's capabilities to produce a ballistic missile with a hypersonic glide vehicle? Well, I don't know, but I would have thought Iran would have significant difficulties doing that by itself. At the very least, I'm going to guess that producing such a machine would require very, very advanced modeling, which would presumably require the use of supercomputers. I don't know whether Iran has the necessary computer power to be able to do something like that. I'm not disputing, by the way, that Iran does have significant technological capabilities, but this does seem to be at a very high-end level. It would also presumably need a very advanced materials science to produce the necessary coatings and materials to produce hypersonic glide vehicles, which would need to go through the atmosphere at extraordinary speeds, absorbing all the enormous heat and energy that involves. And of course, designing that hypersonic glide vehicle would not only require tremendous levels of computing power, it would also doubtless require the data, the aeronautics data to feed through the computers to produce that kind of vehicle. And I have to say, I'm not sure that Iran by itself could do that. If it has produced a missile with that kind of capability, then that is a dramatic technological leap. And I would guess that it has had some assistance in doing that. Its friends, the Chinese and the Russians, do have the necessary computing power. Its friends also have the data, the aeronautics data. The Russians, I happen to know, have been accumulating aeronautics data on a massive scale since the 1940s. Their Central Aeronautics Laboratory, TSAGI, has been, which is in some ways the equivalent of NASA in the United States, has been doing this on a huge scale, and they have massive amount of data of this kind, which they're able to feed through their computers to design aircraft and missiles. It might be that they're sharing some of this data with the Iranians. And of course, the Chinese and the Russians also produce the necessary materials. Both the Chinese and the Russians have exhibited hypersonic glide vehicles. The Russians have the avant-garde hypersonic strategic glide vehicle. The Chinese have exhibited anti-ship missiles with hypersonic glide vehicles. So that capability does exist. It may be that some of this data and some of this material has been shared with Iran, and that might explain the information that we've just had. Now, I want to make it very clear, I don't know that any of this is true, and I want to reiterate again that without in any way, knocking the Iranians' own capabilities, I doubt that they have the range of technology to do something like this, and it may very well be that these reports about this missile with its hypersonic glide vehicle warhead are simply wrong. But if this is true, and if such a missile does actually exist, then it does actually represent not only a major technological leap by Iran and a major leap in capability, but it also suggests something else. Firstly, it suggests considerable cooperation between the Chinese and or the Russians and the Iranians in developing these systems. And it would also suggest that this missile, if it exists, again, all of this is very qualified by that, if it exists, is essentially an anti-ship missile, presumably tasked with countering American aircraft carriers. That is what similar ballistic missiles with hypersonic glide vehicles, which exist in China, appear to be. So that would suggest that the Iranians have developed a capability to attack American Navy carriers. And it also, by the way, suggests, since these missiles have long ranges, that there is some kind of agreement whereby the Iranians are able to access satellite and other data provided by their allies, the Chinese and or the Russians, or the Russians and or the Chinese, depending on who it is. So I just wanted to say all of this because it is an intriguing thought, but I also want to say that I'm not absolutely sure that this has happened or that these reports are true. There's lots of claims and exaggerations. Anyway, the point is that some missiles did get through. Some drones, Shahed drones, also seem to have got through. A certain amount of damage does seem to have been done against these two air bases. but consistent with what we read in that Financial Times article, which I discussed yesterday, this does seem to have been a relatively moderate attack. It doesn't seem to have been a full-scale attack on Israel, and it was perhaps intended mostly to demonstrate resolve to the Iranian people and perhaps even more to Iran's allies across the Middle East, rather than to cause real damage. Now, in one respect, it did actually cause actual damage, and that is that we're getting reports from Israel that defeating this Iranian attack used up stocks of missiles, Israeli air defense missiles, that cost something like $1 billion. Again, I don't know that this is true, and I haven't seen actual confirmation of this, but that's what I've seen some reports say. Now, I'm going to say straight away, for a small country like Israel, that is an unsustainable level of missile use. Even if the Iranians do not have advanced missiles with hypersonic glide vehicle warheads, which perhaps they don't, Israel simply cannot afford every night to fire into the sky missiles, arrays of missiles that cost $1 billion. We've also seen how difficult it is for the United States to sustain adequate levels of production of air defense missiles. There's a very, very interesting article by J.D. Vance, Senator J.D. Vance, pointing out, I think it's in the New York Times, I read it, where he points out the extraordinary difficulties the United States is having in all areas of military production. The US is overextended in terms of the air defense systems that it can produce, and it cannot supplement Israeli air defense missile capabilities at the kind of level that would enable the Israelis to parry this kind of attack night after night after night at the cost that we have seen. $1 billion worth of military equipment expended in a single day is a loss, is real damage, however you look at it. The big question is, how much did the Iranian strikes cost Iran? Now, the Shahed drones, probably not very much. The rockets fired by Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq, Syria, those places, probably not very much either. I'm guessing, by the way, that the Iranian cruise missiles, probably they too, relatively inexpensive. The ballistic missiles probably cost significantly more. And I have to say this, ballistic missiles, which operate with hypersonic glide vehicle warheads, would cost an awful lot more. So I'm not going to make direct comparisons. It may be that for Iran, proportionately, the cost of this strike is as great as the cost to Israel of countering it. Bear in mind that Iran has more limited financial resources. So if, for example, it spent $300 million on carrying out the strike, I'm not saying it did, by the way, it might have been a lot less for all I know. But say it did, that might equate to the $1 billion that Israel is supposed to have spent. So one can't, it seems to me, make immediate assumptions as to who would win in an attrition war if such a war were waged. But I have to say, some of the Iranian weapons that were used, the Shahids, the cruise missiles, the rockets that their allies launched, probably are relatively cheap. The Iranians might have a core of more advanced missiles, but presumably they can conduct attrition against Israel. The Israelis have to shoot down any rockets or drones that are launched against them, however basic they are, because they can't allow them to get through. In an attrition war of this kind, probably over time, the Iranians would win. Just saying. So that's the Iranian side of this. It does seem to me as if the Iranians can say to themselves that they achieved most of their objectives. And that just explains why the Iranians, again, saying something entirely consistent with what we saw in the Financial Times article, have gone out of their way in statements that they made even whilst the attack was underway and in the hours which followed. They have said that the attack was intended as a demonstration of resolve. They wanted to show the Israelis, their power. But if the Israelis didn't act to counter this strike, then the Iranians, for their part, were prepared to draw a line under the whole affair. And that, of course, again, as I said, coming back, is what the Financial Times article was saying. It spoke about the Iranians seeking a calibrated response, and both the way they conducted this operation and their statements are fully consistent with that. Now, we've had comments that are appearing in the media in the United States, which are also consistent with that Financial Times article. And apparently the United States is now urging Israel not to retaliate against this strike. The Biden administration is supposedly telling the Israelis, well, look, you were completely successful. You shot down 99% of the missiles that were launched against you and the drones. You've only experienced minor damage. Apparently, at least so far, we've not had reports that a single person in Israel has been killed. This is a victory. You've successfully parried this attack. So stop. Don't escalate. Don't take this further. And supposedly, there has definitely been a call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And supposedly, this is the message that President Biden conveyed to Prime Minister Netanyahu, that given your success, given your victory, please stop. We don't want to take this further. We don't want to escalate. The Iranians don't want to escalate. We want to keep the situation in the Middle East stable. And since you won this great victory in countering this attack, let's also draw a line under this affair. Again, this is completely consistent with what we were reading in the Financial Times article, which I discussed yesterday. It's interesting to see how the narrative of Israeli success, which we are reading all across the media in the West today, is now being used by the Americans, or so it seems, to de-escalate this crisis, to bring it under control, exactly as that Financial Times article was telling us might happen. Now, having said all of this, the decision ultimately is not going to be made in Washington. It's going to be made in Jerusalem. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is himself under enormous pressure from within his war cabinet and within on the part of the Israeli public. For him to accept an attack from Iran without taking counteraction, I suspect is going to be very difficult indeed. Perhaps it is impossible. Perhaps anyway, he doesn't want to listen to President Biden. One gets the sense that the two men don't really like each other, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is likely to like President Biden even less, since the administration about a week ago, was it 2 weeks ago, put up Senator Chuck Schumer to say that Prime Minister Netanyahu stepped down. I have to say, I think that it's almost certain that the Israelis are going to have to respond. I can't see how they can refuse to respond. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu's position will be very difficult indeed if Israel does not respond. The question is, how extensive will the Israeli response be? And will it target Iran itself, or will it target Iranian allies elsewhere in the Middle East? That, for the moment, remains for me the big unanswered question. To repeat what I said in my program yesterday, there is a very real possibility that despite the Americans and the Iranians both wanting to avoid a general war in the Middle East, a larger conflict in the Middle East, there is a serious risk that the situation might get out of control. The Israelis might feel obliged to carry out a major strike on Iran, in which case the Iranians might feel that they have to respond in kind, and we can easily see how the situation could spiral out of control from that point. And that is clearly the concern across the Middle East and the global community. Every single important government, except the Western governments, which of course are uniting in condemning the Iranian attack, every other government and the United Nations Secretariat are coming out with statements calling urgently for a de-escalation of the crisis, and there is going to be soon a meeting of the UN Security Council where those calls are also going to be made. So we will see what happens. We will see whether American pressure on the Israelis to hold back is effective, whether it might limit the Israeli response so that we start to see a dialing down gradually of the various attacks the Iranians and the Israelis are launching against each other, or whether, on the contrary, the attack is on a scale that the Iranians feel they have to respond to in a big way, leading possibly to an uncontrolled escalation of the whole situation in the Middle East. Now, there's a number of things I do want to say before I finish this discussion in this program up to this point. The first is this: there is an incredibly contrived quality about this crisis up to this time. The crisis began with an Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus. Again, I'm receiving astonishing levels of pushback about my point that that was a completely illegal and unprovoked attack. There's still people who continue to insist that the embassy was being used as some kind of command position, a claim which the Israelis themselves, the Israeli government itself, which has not even acknowledged carrying out that attack, has not made. I've already said that even if the Iranian embassy was being used in that way, an attack on a diplomatic building of that kind is definitely wrong under international law, and for all kinds of other reasons, that Israel had other things it could have done and should have done before even contemplated launching an attack of that kind. And I'm going to say, moreover, that having actually looked at what happened in terms of that attack, my sense is that the attack took place not because the embassy was in fact any kind of command center, but because the Israelis got wind of the fact that two important Iranian generals were attending a meeting at that embassy, probably with representatives of Iran's allies in Syria and Lebanon, and that they couldn't resist the opportunity with all of these people in the same place to come out and kill them. Of course, beyond that, there are people within the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, facing a debacle in Gaza. As I said, there's been a long article in the Wall Street Journal which all but admits that. There are people within the Israeli government who also want or would welcome a bigger crisis at this time with Iran, and potentially a war with Iran, which sucks the United States in. So the crisis began with an Israeli attack on an Iranian embassy building in Damascus, which was unnecessary and illegal. The Iranians have now launched their own attack, which they have tried to modulate as much as possible and have to a certain extent negotiated with the Americans. There have been, as I've said, constructions by both sides of detailed narratives about what is happening, what has happened, and one can even see how these narratives have been constructed and the way in which they're being used. Though, as I said, it's possible, in fact, to get some sense of some of the things that really happened over the course of last night. If this crisis gets out of control, which is highly possible, then it will be because the level of contrivance has broken down and the hardliners in Israel, and by the way, they are matching hardliners in Tehran, of that I have no doubt, are finding that they're being empowered. That is a most dangerous situation. It's astonishing that we have got here. It's again the product of a disastrous failure in diplomacy, first and foremost by the Biden administration. The Biden administration needed to make it absolutely clear to Israel that it was deeply unhappy about the Israeli attack on the embassy building in Damascus. It needed to reassure the Iranians that it didn't agree with that attack. It ought to have considered the Iranian request for a statement from the UN Security Council criticizing that attack. The criticism could have been put together in moderate language, but it could have been made, and the whole crisis could have been diffused. We're now in an escalation on an escalation escalator. There are attempts to slow this escalator going all the way up, and perhaps to stop it from reaching that final point of an all-out Middle East war. But it is terrible that this escalator was allowed to start operating, going up in the first place. Anyway, there we are. The next couple of hours are going to be decisive. We will see how strong Israel's response is going to be. I think it is inconceivable, as I said previously, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet will not respond in some way. It would be so completely out of character for them to take an attack like this lying down, that whatever advice they're getting from the United States, or whatever pleas, rather, they're getting from the United States, I think they're going to disregard. The only question is whether they might also choose to do that which the Iranians have done, which is pull their punches, in which case we might start to see a way out, but there is no guarantee that that is going to happen. So, a dangerous moment in the Middle East. If we are looking at a general war in the Middle East, then the United States, Israel itself, are walking into another trap. All the wars that have been fought in the Middle East that I can think of, going all the way back to the 1982 Lebanon War, have ended badly for the Western powers, and by the way, for Israel itself. I don't have any reason to think that a general war involving Iran, militarily a far more powerful country and a much more widely supported country than any of the other ones that have been attacked up to this point. I have no reason to doubt that that war would also end badly. The Chinese media, as I pointed out, has recently been talking about how the United States has got itself trapped in crises in Ukraine and the Middle East. I don't think the Chinese want an escalation of the crisis in the Middle East. They want stability and peace there, because that also serves their wider interests. But the United States ought to bear in mind that if there is a wider crisis in the Middle East, an uncontrolled war in the Middle East, the Chinese are strongly positioned to take advantage of it. Anyway, that's where I'm going to end my discussion of this crisis up to this point. We're going to have to wait and see what happens. Now, the Iranians and the Americans clearly are in contact. They are trying to negotiate with each other. The Americans have shown a complete inability to control their Israeli ally. Of course, the Americans are divided amongst themselves. I have to say, I am deeply shocked by some of the hysterical commentary that I'm reading in both the American and British media, especially the British media, basically urging all-out war with no regard for the consequences. And I've no doubt that there are people within the US government who are also urging this as well. But anyway, we will see whether whatever agreements were reached over the previous week between the Americans and the Iranians, whether they're strong enough to hold, whether the Americans are able to put enough pressure on the Israelis to persuade the Israelis to act with some degree of restraint. I'm not a betting man. I wouldn't want to put money on this. But anyway, on that, much now depends, and we will see where this is all going. Anyway, let me now turn to the other great crisis that we are witnessing, which is the crisis in Ukraine. Now, this crisis may seem to be more under control, but that is largely because the party that is ultimately dominating the situation, which is Russia, has shown itself consistently to have a level of discipline in its conduct of this conflict, which is frankly extraordinary. Some would say superhuman. I make this point. All I would say is contrast the statements Russian leaders make about leaders in the West, even the most extreme Russian leaders like Dmitry Medvedev, with what Western leaders currently are saying about the Russians. The German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, made, I thought, an absolutely incredible speech in which he compared Russian President Putin with a mustachioed gentleman who perished in Berlin in April 1945. I mean, that comparison is, I have no words to describe how offensive and absurd that comparison is, and how grotesquely untrue. We have claims pouring out of Western capitals about how the Russians are on the move and are intent on conquering the whole of Europe. We have incessant misrepresentations of things that Russian leaders have said. We've had another claim from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz that the Russians cut off gas supplies to Germany, which is, again, so entirely false that it leaves me speechless. We have things written every day in the media in the West about Russia generally, which, as I said, leave me speechless as well. We've had actions taken against the Russians, freezing of their central bank reserves, demands that those central bank reserves be seized and confiscated, action taken to stop Russian airlines flying Russians to Europe. There's now an idea circulating that Russian citizens will not be able to board any plane or fly in any plane over European airspace. Incredible things. We've had weapons supplied to Ukraine, which have launched attacks deep inside Russia itself. We'll come to that soon. All of this. And in the face of all of this, the Russians have acted, I'm not going to say with forbearance, because of course they are conducting a military operation, but with a degree of self-discipline, which, as I said, is astonishing. And that is what distinguishes this crisis at the moment. The Iranians are able to match that level of self-discipline in the way they conduct their side of the conflict that we see ongoing in the Middle East. Well, I will have to say this, my respect for them will increase massively. But anyway, let's actually go to what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. Now, there were more reports yesterday of more attacks by the Russians using their missiles and drones against Ukraine, but the amount of information that I've received is not very extensive, and of course, it's been drowned out by the story of the Iranian strike on Israel. On top of that, there was a very significant missile and artillery strikes by the Ukrainians on Russian positions in towns like Tokmak, specifically in Zaporozhye region. Now, people are not saying this, but I wonder whether some of the strikes that took place in Zaporozhye region, the Ukrainian strikes, were carried out with ATACMS missiles. There's reports that some of these missiles hit positions fairly far behind Russian lines, that cluster munitions were used, and we know that at least some of the ATACMS missiles supplied to Ukraine have cluster munitions, have cluster munition warheads. Though it also seems that HIMARS missiles were also used. So anyway, there was this Ukrainian strike. It did knock out some Russian artillery pieces. It won't have changed the overall balance in the fighting in Zaporozhye region. In fact, this morning we got news that the Russians have made some rather minor advances in Rabotino and rather more significant advances, gradually gaining control of more and more of Bradley Square, gradually pushing the Ukrainians out of their positions there. But anyway, we've had this report of the Russian strikes, the Ukrainian counter-strikes. We've had lots of discussion and analysis in the media in the West about what the deployment by the Russians of the Kh-69 subsonic stealth missile, cruise missile that was used to destroy the power station south of Kiev, what that means. Anyway, a lot of discussion about that. But what has actually been going on the battlefronts? Well, here we are now getting increasingly despairing comments from the Ukrainians themselves. Firstly, General Syrskyi, the military commander-in-chief of Ukraine, has admitted that the situation is becoming very bad in the Avdiivka direction. He's also now come out with a further statement that he thinks that the Russians are going to try to capture Chasov Yar before Victory Day on the 9th of May. I don't believe that, by the way. I have never seen a single instance over the course of the special military operation where the Russians have allowed calendar dates to determine their military timetables. Just saying. But anyway, that perhaps is a further sign that the situation on the battlefronts, and in Chasov Yar specifically, is turning out very badly for Ukraine. There's also been a really despairing comment from Zelensky, also about how badly the situation is going. And apparently he's also had a meeting, I think it was with students in Kiev, in which he spoke about the fact that an entire unit of the Ukrainian army surrendered en masse to the Russians in the Avdiivka area, and that has put other Ukrainian units in that area in a very bad situation. And perhaps in response to this mass surrender of a Ukrainian military unit, there have been reports that not reports, it's been confirmed, General Syrskyi himself has issued a general order announcing that he's going to tighten further discipline within the Ukrainian army to prevent desertions and such things. And it's another rather fiercely worded order. So what actually is happening on the battlefronts? provoking all these despairing comments from the Ukrainians. Let's turn first of all to that claim about the mass desertion or surrender of a Ukrainian force in unit somewhere on the battle lines. And here I'm going to say I'm a bit confused, because there is a report from the Russian Defense Ministry that 9 Ukrainian servicemen from the 25th Airborne Brigade, in other words, paratroopers, did surrender in Vodanye. This is the village to the north of Pervomaisky, where there was intense battles a couple of days ago. Apparently these soldiers are very bitter and very angry that they'd been essentially abandoned by their commanders. They were without equipment and ammunition and that kind of thing, and found themselves in an impossible position, and they asked to be allowed to retreat, and the order came that they shouldn't be allowed to retreat, and they felt that they were being led like cattle to the slaughter. This is what the Russian Defense Ministry say they have said. And for that reason, they decided to surrender. Well, that's the report I've seen from the Russian Defense Ministry. But 9 men, well, that's perhaps a squad of men. I suppose you could call it a unit, but it hardly seems enough to have had the kind of effect on the events on the battlefield that Zelensky is talking about. Now, yesterday on the military summary channel, Dima said that in fact the unit that had surrendered were numbered around 200 men, a reduced battalion-sized unit, in other words, and that he seemed to link that to the events, the fighting between Netailovo and Yasnobrodovka, these 2 villages to the northwest of Pervomaisky. And Dima has said that the Ukrainian positions around these 2 villages are collapsing, and he provided a very interesting satellite picture in which he showed the area where Russian shelling was most concentrated, and that satellite photo showed that the Russians were shelling heavily Ukrainian positions just behind the front lines in these 2 villages, Netailovo and Yasnobrodovka, and that it looked as if Ukrainian troops in these 2 villages were now in some kind of operational encirclement, and that might have been connected with this mass surrender of the men of this battalion of the 25th Airborne Brigade, and that was what Zelensky is talking about. Now, that is completely plausible, and of course, it's the case, no doubt, that Dima, who is enormously punctilious on checking his information, is getting this information from various sources which are not accessible to me. But I have to say that I've not been able to corroborate this claim. If an entire battalion of the Ukrainian army has surrendered, then that is huge news. It would be the biggest mass surrender of Ukrainian troops since the fall of Avdiivka back in February, and it would match in scale the surrenders that took place there, though it would be a surrender made in the heat of battle. So it would be very big news. It would be perhaps a sign that it would be a further sign that Ukrainian forces are indeed crumbling. But I want to repeat again, I'm not disputing what Dima has said. It's just that I haven't been able to find confirmation of this myself. Unless, of course, you treat Zelensky's words as confirmation, which, of course, in some respects they might be. But regardless of that, let's put all that aside, intriguing though that claim is, and look at what is actually happening on the front lines, which we can verify. Firstly, reports earlier, late yesterday, that Novomykhailovka has indeed fallen, and that the Russians have now pushed the Ukrainians entirely out of that village. Apparently, this has come from multiple sources now, including Ukrainian ones. It seems that there is no real doubt that the Russians now control the whole of Novomykhailovka. There have been warnings that it will take the Russian Defense Ministry several days, as often happens, before they finally confirm that Novomykhailovka is indeed under complete Russian control. But that now does look as if it is indisputable. And the Ukrainians have retreated to the western village of Paraskovievke. It's a small place, as I've discussed before. Fighting is going on around that village. The Russians are also attacking Konstantinovka, a rather bigger village immediately to the west of Paraskovievke. And there's also reports that the Russians have now reactivated their advance in Georgievka village to the north of these places. They're also pushing westwards, the ultimate objective presumably being Karakovo. And there's also reports that the Russians have also increased pressure on Vuhledar, that they've captured more positions southwest of Vuhledar, further south, and it does look as if we're starting to see the battlefield around Vuhledar being shaped for a sustained attack to capture this fortified town. The situation around Vuhledar seems to me very similar to the one that we're seeing in the north around the other fortified town there, which is Siversk. The Russians are making significant moves around Vuhledar. The battles for Novomykhailovka, Georgievka, to some extent Krasnogorovka as well, all seem to be ultimately connected with an eventual attack on Vuhledar, cutting off the supply lines to Vuhledar, isolating Vuhledar, encircling it, and eventually capturing it. And the Russians also seem to be in the process of doing something similar in the north around Siversk. Attacks on Belogorovka, attacks on other villages to the west of Siversk, reports that they have perhaps captured these villages, the capture of a fortified position the Ukrainians have on a hill near the railway station of Vimka. Vimka itself apparently likely to be attacked very soon, probably captured by the Russians very soon. Reports that the Russians are also moving towards capturing another village, Razdolovka, and also reports appearing yesterday that the Russians have activated frontal positions north of Siversk, that they're attacking villages to the north of Siversk, which they'd previously attacked in the summer of 2022, but where there hasn't been much fighting recently. Anyway, they seem to be preparing the ground for an attack on Siversk, just as they seem to be preparing the ground for an attack on Vuhledar. And it's quite plausible that these two offensives towards Vuhledar and towards Siversk will become much more powerful and that we will see a simultaneous crisis in these two places, perhaps in the second half of May. And in the meantime, we're getting lots of reports, very heavy fighting in Krasnogorovka, lots of reports that the Russians are now clearing more of Krasnogorovka. I get the sense that the situation in Krasnogorovka is beginning to develop in something of the same way that the fighting in Avdiivka did. The Russians are slowly working to cut off the supply lines to Krasnogorovka, even as they put pressure on the Ukrainian defenders in Krasnogorovka itself. And this is exactly the pattern of what happened in Avdiivka in January and February of this year. So lots of fighting there. But perhaps going back to that report about the surrender of perhaps of the whole battalion of the 25th Airborne Brigade, the Ukrainian Airborne Brigade, well, it does look as if the Russians are indeed now in the process of capturing Netailovo and Yasnobrodovka. There's some reasons to think that Yasnobrodovka itself is on the brink of being captured by the Russians. Apparently, it's a relatively small place, and it seems also that the Russians have indeed broken into Umansk, and that there is indeed fighting going on there too. And elsewhere, we're getting reports that the Russians have largely cleared now Berdichi in the north, still fighting going on just to the south of Berdichi in Semyonovka. I have to say, if Berdichi falls, with the Russians also in control of Orlovka to the south of Semyonovka, it seems to me that in that case, Semyonovka, the Ukrainian troops in Semyonovka are in a sandwich and likely to be encircled. And I would have thought again that it would make more sense for the Ukrainians to pull out of Semyonovka fast. Some reports that they only control around a third of that village. Does seem very strange that they would fight and go on fighting there and risk encirclement. But perhaps even more dramatic news, and perhaps the main weight of the Russian advance at the moment, is not in these western places west of Avdiivka. It is north of Avdiivka. It seems that the Russians are now coming very close to Ocheretina. It's been suggested that the main attack on this populated area south of Ocheretina on the railway, to me it looks like the village of Novobakhmutovka, but others are saying it's not. I don't know what the name of this place is, if it is not Novobakhmutovka, but on the maps, to the extent I can read them, it does seem to be Novobakhmutovka. Anyway, if this place is captured, apparently Ukrainian positions in Ocheretina itself will start to collapse, will become undefendable. And the Russians still apparently pushing hard along the road to the west of Novokalinova and Keramik, further to the east, and gradually taking Ukrainian troops in this area in a pincer. So, major crisis, as I've said already, for the Ukrainians in this area as well. But perhaps most dramatic news coming from Chasov Yar, it looks as if the Ukrainian troops in the micro-district are now essentially surrounded. I'm not saying that there are Russian troops to the west of them, between the micro-district and the Ukrainian troops across the canal in the main part of Chasov Yar itself. But it's clear that the Russians, in effect, dominate the roads. They have Sukhoi 25s flying over the micro-district and indeed Chasov Yar itself. It's most unlikely that any troops can retreat along these roads or that reinforcements can arrive. And it is increasingly looking as if the Russians, with reports that Bogdanovka has now come fully under their control, and with the Russians in the process of capturing the village the hill to the northwest of Bogdanovka, that the Russians will soon be in a position to cross the canal to the northwest of Chasov Yar and attack the main part of Chasov Yar west of the canal from the north, even as their troops advance from Chasov Yar from the southeast from Ivanivska. So one can understand perhaps why Syrskyi is saying that the Russians are looking to capture Chasov Yar by the 9th of May. Probably that is premature. I mean, the 9th of May is, 3 weeks away? It would be demanding, challenging for the Russians to be able to take Chasov Yar by that point, but perhaps they can. The fact that Syrskyi is talking in this way tells us how critical the situation in Chasov Yar has become. So, an operational crisis for the Ukrainians right across the front lines. And anyway, they are themselves saying that entire units of their army are starting to surrender. And though I can't quite work out where that has happened, probably Dima is right in what he's saying, the very fact that they're talking in this way tells us how bad the situation for the Ukrainians has become. Now, the West now has a further crisis on its hands, and this must be another reason, I would have thought, why the United States in particular is going to want to de-escalate the situation in the Middle East. Because on top of the missile war that the Russians are now waging against Ukraine, we have the possibility of a missile war being waged by Iran against Israel. Of course, Israel can counter, they can launch missile strikes of their own and airstrikes against Iran. But Iran is a huge country, very mountainous country, very easy to conceal in such a vast territory, important installations. And of course, Iran does have an air defense system, maybe not as advanced as the Israeli, but then the very size of Iran itself provides protection. Israel itself, a very small country territorially, extremely small. And of course, it has an air defense system of probably incomparable density, but we see the enormous cost, $1 billion, that has had to be spent in repelling a single Iranian attack over a course of a single night. So, Israel, inherently more vulnerable, I would have thought, to a prolonged missile offensive from Iran, assuming Iranian industrial capabilities, than Israel. Israel more vulnerable than Iran is. So the Americans, if there is going to be an escalation of this conflict, and if there's going to be missile strikes by Iran on Israel on a regular basis, Israel cannot itself produce air defense missiles in the necessary quantities to counter Iranian missile threats, presumably. The United States is going to have to step in to do that. Air defense missiles already in desperately short supply. How does the United States, if there's a missile war going on between Israel and Iran, continue to provide air defense missiles to Ukraine. It's going to be, I would have thought, impossibly difficult. But anyway, lots of hand-wringing, lots of complaints coming from Ukraine that they're effectively out of air defense missiles, that they need more air defense missiles, that the Kh-69 and the Kinzhal are almost unstoppable, but that perhaps with Patriot missiles, Ukraine can stop these missiles. I doubt it, by the way, but anyway, that's what they're saying. And they are pleading and begging for more air defense missiles, and are basically saying that without more air defense missiles, they can't keep fighting because the Russians dominate the airspace of Ukraine, and that there is really no counter to this. Well, Germany has now announced that it is going to provide a further Patriot air defense missile system. This after the Germans said that they wouldn't. As always, they reversed themselves. They now say that they will. It'll take weeks before it arrives. We don't know whether the technicians to operate the system, where they're going to come from. Again, going back to Dima at the Military Summary channel, he's speculating, he's probably rightly, by the way, that this air defense system that the Germans are delivering to Ukraine is going to be located in western Ukraine to protect the gas storage facilities there, which the Russians have been sort of attacking. Those gas storage facilities being essential for keeping Europe supplied with gas. Anyway, no real response to this. There are not enough air defense missile systems in the world. Certainly the Russians can keep up production of air defense missiles, and they're doing so at a prodigious rate. And if the Americans now have to provide the necessary missile cover to Israel to parry further Iranian attacks, then fewer missiles still for Ukraine. Something has to give. This is the trap that the neocons have led the United States into. It now finds itself in two huge conflicts, one in Ukraine, one in the Middle East. Neither is going well. Both are stretching American resources beyond breaking point. And the Chinese, as I said, already saying to themselves that the Americans are trapped. Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that. There it is. We will see whether the Americans are able to lean on their Israeli friends to prevent a further escalation in the Middle East. In Ukraine, as the Russians, as Vasily Nebenzia, Russia's ambassador, said a few days ago to the United Nations Security Council, whatever happens now, the Russian army will continue its advance, and there is nothing the West can do to prevent it. Both in the Middle East and in Ukraine, the situation calls for an initiative to make peace. This US administration doesn't seem to be capable of that. And the commitments crisis that the United States faces, which I discussed in programs I did years ago on this channel, before the conflicts in Ukraine and the one we now have in the Middle East began or were even being thought about, is now with us. Anyway, that is where I end my program today. We'll see what Israel does over the next 48 hours. That decision now being crucial. And in the meantime, all that remains for me is to wish you well, to remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Check out our shop where you can find all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you want to support this channel, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.